In the quiet hush of early colonial Massachusetts, the town of Salem Village lay surrounded by whispering forests and creaking trees. The year was 1692, and the wind carried with it more than just the scent of pine, it carried unease. The villagers, bound by strict Puritan beliefs, lived in constant fear of sin, the devil, and divine judgment. Life was modest, almost silent. Fields were plowed in stillness. Homes were dimly lit with flickering candles. But beneath the surface of this calm existence, something darker stirred. Tensions had already been brewing. Factional disputes, rivalries between families, and the fear of Native American attacks had left the people anxious and easily shaken. They believed the devil could walk among them, possessing hearts and minds. It was in Reverend Samuel Parris's household that the whisper of witchcraft first took hold. His daughter, Betty Parris, only 9 years old, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11, began to act strangely. They screamed, contorted, and claimed unseen forces tormented them. Physicians could find no illness. So, the diagnosis came, witchcraft. A whisper became a murmur, the murmur a storm. The village gathered in concern, but also fear. These weren't just sick children. They were said to be cursed. Tormented. And they named names. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman from the Caribbean, was among the first accused. Alongside her were Sarah Good, a beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. The whispers of suspicion grew louder. The trials were not yet underway, but the seeds had been planted. Salem was changing. It was no longer just a quiet village. It was becoming a stage for fear, accusation, and the dark whisper of hysteria. The candlelight flickered in Reverend Parris's home, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the cold wind rustled the trees like a whispering chorus, soft, eerie, and persistent. Inside, fear was growing. The girls, Betty and Abigail, now joined by others, and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott, continued their strange behavior. They twisted their bodies unnaturally, screamed out sudden cries, and pointed to invisible beings in the room. They wailed at unseen claws scratching at their skin, and moaned at unseen fires burning within their souls. When asked who tormented them, they whispered. Tituba. Sarah Good. Sarah Osborne. These 3 women became the first accused, chosen not because of evidence, but because of difference. Tituba was enslaved, foreign, and spoke of spirits. Sarah Good was poor, often muttering to herself. Sarah Osborne defied Puritan norms, rarely attending church and marrying a servant. The village seized upon their names. On March 1, 1692, the 3 women were brought in for questioning, though the questioning resembled more of an inquisition. In the dim meeting house, watched by neighbors and feared by children, they stood alone. Sarah Good protested her innocence, her voice shaking. "I am no witch," she said, again and again. She was desperate, frightened, and dismissed as wicked. Sarah Osborne was frail, ill, and barely able to speak. Her denial was barely a whisper, her health failing. But Tituba, she chose a different path. She confessed. Her voice was soft and strange, and her words painted a world of spirits and shadows. She told of how the devil had come to her, how she had seen a tall man in black, how she was made to sign the devil's book. She said there were other witches, many others. Hidden in the village. Watching. Waiting. Her confession, perhaps forced, perhaps imagined, did something terrible, it made the unseen visible. It gave the villagers something to believe. Something to fear. Something to pursue. The accusations grew. More names were whispered in the night. The village no longer slept easily. Children cried out in their beds. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. The old paths through the forest were avoided. The silence of the woods no longer felt peaceful, it felt haunted. The trials had not yet begun. But the stage was set. Salem, once quiet and devout, was now a village held captive by fear. The first accused had spoken. Or been spoken for. And the whisper of witchcraft was now a roar inside trembling hearts. The snow had begun to melt in Salem village, revealing the thawing earth beneath, a symbol of the buried fears now surfacing in the hearts of its people. March turned slowly to April, and with it, the quiet town fell deeper into a shadowed trance. Word of the strange afflictions and the women's confessions spread swiftly. Not just through Salem village, but to nearby communities, Danvers, Ipswich, Andover. What began as an isolated scare became a growing storm, whispering through woods and farmland alike. New girls began to claim visions. New screams echoed from homes. They collapsed to the ground, seized, wailed, and accused. And the townsfolk, devout and desperate, believed. In this Puritan world, the devil was not an idea, he was a presence. A being who could slip silently into the soul of a neighbor, or a friend. And now, in Salem, that belief found fire. The accused began to number in the dozens. Bridget Bishop was one of the next named. She was outspoken, dressed more flamboyantly than others, and owned a tavern, scandalous in the eyes of Puritan society. She had once been accused of witchcraft before, and now, the whispers returned. Against her. Louder than ever. Then came Rebecca Nurse. Elderly, kind, and deeply respected, she was a shocking name. But even the good were not safe. A simple dispute with neighbors led to her accusation. She was taken in chains, as her family wept. The jails began to fill. The whispers spread like wildfire. Husbands turned on wives. Children on mothers. Servants on masters. Any quarrel, any odd word, any small misstep might be twisted into evidence. And as each person named another, the web of suspicion grew tighter, and darker. Spectral evidence was now accepted in court. If someone claimed they saw a ghost or spirit shaped like the accused, that was enough. The courts allowed it. Hysteria had replaced reason. Faith had replaced law. And still, more came forward. Sometimes to save themselves. Sometimes to settle scores. And sometimes, perhaps, out of true fear. No one knew who would be next. No one slept soundly. Candles burned long into the night. Mothers watched over their children with frightened eyes. The forest, once a place of gathering wood, now seemed filled with unseen forces. And the whispering continued, behind doors, in churches, along the fields. The Puritan dream had become a nightmare. And in Salem, the line between truth and madness had all but vanished. By May of 1692, the colony of Massachusetts was drowning in whispered accusations. The prison cells overflowed. Over 50 people had been named. And the need for judgment pressed heavily on the shoulders of the leaders. So, Governor William Phips created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a name meaning, to hear and to determine. But what it truly meant for Salem, was fear turned into formal judgment. 7 judges were appointed, led by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man known more for his devout faith than legal mercy. The trials were no longer rumor and shadow. They were to become official. Public. Punishable. The courtroom was a narrow, echoing chamber, lit by high windows and flickering candles. Villagers crowded inside, huddled together on wooden benches, while the afflicted girls sat in clear view. They would wail, cry out, and tremble whenever the accused entered the room, claiming to see spirits attacking them even as testimony was given. Bridget Bishop, the first to stand trial, denied the charges. Calmly. Softly. "I am innocent," she said. "I know nothing of witchcraft." But the court had already heard the girls' claims. They said her specter choked them, pinched them, clawed them in the night. The court allowed it. They accepted spectral evidence, the unseen visions, dreams, and feelings of the afflicted, as real. as valid. It was a chilling precedent. Logic was set aside in favor of faith and fear. Bridget Bishop was convicted. On June 10, 1692, she was taken to Gallows Hill, a barren rise just outside Salem. There, beneath a gray sky, she was hanged. Her body was cut down quickly. Buried in an unmarked grave. There was no service. No prayer. Only silence. Her death opened a door. One that would not close. Others soon followed. Sarah Good. Elizabeth Howe. Susanna Martin. Rebecca Nurse. Each swore innocence. Each was condemned. Their families begged. Their neighbors wept. But the court was determined to cleanse the land. The judges believed they were defending Salem from a terrible evil. But in truth, they were deepening the nightmare. The townsfolk began to murmur in secret. Some questioned the court. Others feared questioning would lead to their own arrest. Dissent was dangerous. Silence, safer. Even ministers, including the well-known Cotton Mather, urged caution, but his pleas were soft and half-hearted. Meanwhile, his father, Increase Mather, remained distant, uncertain of what to make of the unraveling terror. By May of 1692, the colony of Massachusetts was drowning in whispered accusations. The prison cells overflowed. Over 50 people had been named. And the need for judgment pressed heavily on the shoulders of the leaders. So, Governor William Phips created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a name meaning, to hear and to determine. But what it truly meant for Salem, was fear turned into formal judgment. 7 judges were appointed, led by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man known more for his devout faith than legal mercy. The trials were no longer rumor and shadow. They were to become official. Public. Punishable. The courtroom was a narrow, echoing chamber, lit by high windows and flickering candles. Villagers crowded inside, huddled together on wooden benches, while the afflicted girls sat in clear view. They would wail, cry out, and tremble whenever the accused entered the room, claiming to see spirits attacking them even as testimony was given. Bridget Bishop, the first to stand trial, denied the charges. Calmly. Softly. "I am innocent," she said. "I know nothing of witchcraft." But the court had already heard the girls' claims. They said her specter choked them, pinched them, clawed them in the night. The court allowed it. They accepted spectral evidence, the unseen visions, dreams, and feelings of the afflicted, as real. As valid. It was a chilling precedent. Logic was set aside in favor of faith and fear. Bridget Bishop was convicted. On June 10, 1692, she was taken to Gallows Hill, a barren rise just outside Salem. There, beneath a gray sky, she was hanged. Her body was cut down quickly. Buried in an unmarked grave. There was no service. No prayer. Only silence. Her death opened a door. One that would not close. Others soon followed. Sarah Good. Elizabeth Howe. Susanna Martin. Rebecca Nurse. Each swore innocence. Each was condemned. Their families begged. Their neighbors wept. But the court was determined to cleanse the land. The judges believed they were defending Salem from a terrible evil. But in truth, they were deepening the nightmare. The townsfolk began to murmur in secret. Some questioned the court. Others feared questioning would lead to their own arrest. Dissent was dangerous. Silence, safer. Even ministers, including the well-known Cotton Mather, urged caution, but his pleas were soft and half-hearted. Meanwhile, his father, Increase Mather, remained distant, uncertain of what to make of the unraveling terror. While the gallows stood grim on the hill, Salem's jails groaned with weight, both of the accused and of the silence that settled thick upon them. Cold stone walls held in more than just bodies, they trapped fear, desperation, and forgotten voices. There were 4 jails involved, in Salem, Boston, Ipswich, and Cambridge. And within their damp, narrow corridors, over 100 people waited, men, women, and even children, chained and confined, many without trials. Some had spent weeks. Others, months. Inside, the air was heavy. The cells were small, dark, and foul-smelling. Prisoners slept on straw, if they could sleep at all. Food was meager. Water, scarce. Illness ran unchecked. Many grew weak. Some died before ever reaching trial. Infants were born in chains. Elderly prisoners passed in silence. Entire families were held together, or torn apart. Among the jailed was Martha Corey, a woman who had spoken out against the trials. Her outspokenness made her suspect. She had dared to say the accusers might be lying. For that, she was called a witch. Her own husband, Giles Corey, stood by her, until he, too, was accused. In the jails, the accused shared whispered prayers. They clung to scraps of faith and fragments of hope. Some confessed in desperation, believing it might spare them. Others held fast to innocence, knowing it could mean death. The guards walked the halls with unreadable faces. Some were cruel. Others turned their eyes away, unable to meet the gaze of women they had once known, now broken in body and spirit. And still, more arrived. As autumn approached, the jails were overflowing. Families were forced to sell land, crops, or animals to afford the cost of imprisonment. Yes, the accused were charged for their own jail time, their chains, even their food. It was a cruel economy built on suffering. Outside, the trials continued. Inside, the prisoners listened for the names being called next. They prayed not to hear their own, or their children's, or their spouses. Those who once walked freely in the fields of Salem were now shadows behind stone, waiting. Not just for trial, but for the world to come to its senses. The walls of the jails did not echo with shouting. They whispered. With weeping. With prayers. With final words never heard beyond their cold stone. And in that darkness, Salem's heart continued to crack. Let your breath settle, imagine the hush of a crowded cell, the creak of chains in the dark, and the faintest cry of someone still hoping to be believed. Not all who were accused found their fate at the gallows. Some met death in ways far more brutal, and far more silent. Giles Corey was over 80 years old when he was accused of witchcraft. A farmer. A strong man. Proud. He had watched his wife, Martha, be taken to jail, and now he, too, was caught in the storm. But Giles, he chose a different path. When brought before the court, he refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty. In the eyes of the law, without a plea, a trial could not proceed. But the court would not be denied. To force a confession, they chose an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure, pressing. Giles Corey was taken to a field near the jail. There, on September 19, 1692, he was stripped and laid down in a shallow pit. A wooden board was placed upon his chest. And then, stones. Heavy ones. One at a time. With each stone, they asked him to plead. But Giles said nothing. The sheriff leaned close to his weathered face. "How do you plead?" he asked. And Giles, with what little breath remained, whispered just 2 words. More weight. The stones kept coming. No cries. No pleas. Just silence, and the creaking of wood, and the settling of stone upon flesh and bone. After 2 days of torture, Giles Corey died. His chest crushed. His voice silenced. But his defiance, eternal. He never confessed. And because of that, his land passed to his children. Perhaps this was his plan. Perhaps it was pride. Or perhaps it was simply the last resistance of a man who refused to be broken by fear. Word of his death spread fast. Even among the judges, there was unease. Some began to doubt the course of justice. But others continued forward. The trials had gained momentum, like a wheel spinning faster, crushing all beneath it. Yet Giles Corey's death lingered in Salem's memory. It echoed. In whispered corners, people began to ask, was this truly God's will? Was this justice? Or was this madness? The whisper of stones in the field. The silence of a man refusing to speak, became louder than all the screams in the courtroom. Now hush, and imagine the quiet weight pressing on a heart that refused to yield. By October, the number of those accused had grown into the dozens, and the whispers in Salem no longer came only from the mouths of children or the wind in the trees. They came from within, the hearts of townsfolk, the voices of ministers, the prayers of those beginning to doubt. And in the crowded jail cells, voices once silenced began to whisper again. The accused, many held for months, began to write letters, quiet, trembling pleas for mercy. Some asked for new trials. Some begged for death to come quickly. Others, like Mary Easty, wrote not for themselves, but for the future. Mary Easty, sister to Rebecca Nurse, was among the accused. Though released once, she was rearrested days later. From her cell, she wrote a gentle petition to the court, pleading not to save herself, but to stop the bloodshed. It is a great wrong to hang any more, for they are innocent, she whispered from behind the bars. Her words fell like soft rain on hard stone, barely heard, but deeply felt. Others, too, began to speak, not of guilt, but of visions. Of dreams. Of God's silence. Some confessed, hoping to live. Others refused, choosing death. The whisper of spectral evidence, once so powerful, now began to feel fragile. Subjective. Dangerous. Some judges began to squirm in their seats. Some jurors wept in private. The air in Salem had shifted. Even the accusers were changing. The girls, Betty, Abigail, and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, once so sure, so bold, now trembled at their own growing power. Some began accusing those closest to the court, wives of governors, daughters of ministers. The line between enemy and ally disappeared. This frightened even the most faithful. If no one was safe, what justice was left? And then, the court heard something unexpected. Some of the afflicted began to recant. Quietly. Shamefully. They said they had lied. Or imagined things. Or had been pressured. These weren't dramatic retractions. But small, whispered regrets that slipped between courtroom walls like fading candlelight. A few ministers, too, grew bolder in their warnings. Increase Mather, father to Cotton Mather, finally spoke aloud. It is better that 10 witches go free, than that one innocent person be condemned. It was a crack in the foundation. Small. But there. Governor Phipps, who had once supported the trials, returned from military duty. When his own wife was whispered about, he acted. He suspended the court. Just like that, the roar of accusation fell into uneasy silence. The gallows stood empty. The jails remained crowded. But the air had changed. The fear remained, but so too did the guilt. October 29, 1692. The courtroom, once a place of roaring accusations and trembling witnesses, stood silent. The long benches were cold. The candlelight flickered not with urgency, but with weariness. Governor William Phipps, troubled by the path Salem had taken, finally made a choice that would end the bloodshed. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the very machine that had fed the gallows with names and fear. He had returned to find not order, but chaos. The colony was split. Respectable people had been hanged. Prominent ministers were at odds. His own wife had been whispered about, named by the same girls who had accused the town's outcasts. That, perhaps, was the final crack. The court's closing marked not just a legal shift, but a moment of deep and painful reckoning. Though the executions had stopped, the jails were still full. Over 150 people remained imprisoned across Massachusetts. Families had lost homes, land, and loved ones. Children had watched mothers dragged away. Husbands had been broken in court. Churches were split between believers and doubters. To bring some resolution, new, more cautious court was formed, the Superior Court of Judicature. This court, beginning in January of 1693, rejected spectral evidence. It required proper proof, witnesses, documents, real confession. With that, the tide began to turn. More and more accused were acquitted. Some were released simply due to lack of evidence. Others had confessed previously but now retracted. Even those who had once been condemned found a path to freedom. But not all were so lucky. Some still remained imprisoned due to unpaid jail fees. Even in release, they were bound by debt. And some would never return home. The town of Salem, though quieter now, was not healed. Neighbors avoided each other. Ministers spoke more cautiously. And in homes across the village, whispers lingered, of shame, of sorrow, and of the faces they would never see again. The courtroom doors were closed. But the echo of judgment still lingered in every wooden beam, every creaking floorboard, every soul that had once believed they were fighting evil. What remained was silence. A silence heavy with regret. And as the snow began to fall once more over Salem village, it covered not just graves and gallows, but the broken pieces of a community that had nearly destroyed itself. Winter settled over Salem like a blanket of cold silence. The wind no longer carried cries or curses, but instead drifted gently between chimneys and frozen fields. And yet, beneath that quiet snow, guilt and grief stirred softly, like embers that refused to die. Though the executions had ended, the wounds remained open. Families who had lost loved ones walked through the village with hollow eyes. 20 innocent people had been executed. More than 100 imprisoned. And countless more carried the invisible weight of accusation, suspicion, and fear. Church pews once full were now half empty. Ministers, once trusted, were now questioned. Neighbors who had accused each other exchanged no words. The trust that bound the village had been torn, thread by delicate thread. Children, those once thought to be victims, grew quiet. Some of the afflicted girls disappeared from public life. Betty Paris, the first child to show symptoms, was sent away. Abigail Williams, who had named so many, vanished from history. Their whispered cries in court became memories, fading, but never forgotten. And then there were the families of the dead. The Nurse family. The Proctors. The Coreys. They did not remain silent. Slowly, and with great sorrow, they began to speak out. They wrote petitions, challenged the courts, and begged the colony to recognize its mistake. But the colony was slow to listen. The new courts offered little. No apologies. No compensation. The jailers demanded fees. The sheriffs kept possessions seized from the accused. And though some prisoners were freed, many had lost everything. Still, the voices of the grieving grew stronger. By 1697, 5 years after the first accusations, a day of fasting and reflection was declared, a quiet day to mourn what had been done. Churches prayed. Ministers repented. And yet, it felt small. Too small. Over time, the court's own judges began to confess. Samuel Sewall, one of the 7 judges, stood in church and publicly begged for God's forgiveness. His voice trembled. His eyes wet with tears. He said nothing could undo what had been done, but that he would wear his guilt like a chain for the rest of his life. And he did. Others remained silent, even until death. The people of Salem tried to move on. Fields were planted again. Weddings were held. Babies were born. But the shadow of 1692 stretched long across their lives. The snow that winter melted into spring. But the pain lingered, like footsteps in frost, never quite erased. And still, at night, the wind whispered through the trees of Gallows Hill. Rebecca Nurse. Sarah Good. Martha Corey. George Burroughs. John Proctor. Elizabeth Howe. Mary Easty. Giles Corey. Bridget Bishop. These were not witches. They were people. Parents. Neighbors. Souls now lost to panic and misunderstanding. In the years that followed the trials, many of the accused who survived tried to return to ordinary life. But ordinary life was gone. Their names carried shame. Their reputation stained, even without conviction. And those who had confessed, often to save their lives, were haunted by that choice. Their whispered lies, forced by fear, now echoed as quiet guilt within them. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, was one of the fortunate ones. She was pregnant when condemned, and so her execution was delayed. By the time her child was born, the court had been dissolved. She was spared, but her husband was not. She lived on, a widow branded by whispers. She petitioned the government to restore her family's name. To reclaim the land that had been taken. It took years, but in time, the court granted it. For some, it was a small justice. But for many, justice never came. The orphans of the accused were left to fend for themselves. The homes of the executed were abandoned or sold. The possessions of the condemned had been seized, never returned. Even the churches struggled. Ministers debated how to address the trials. Some admitted their errors. Others refused to acknowledge them at all. But the most haunting voices were the ones we would never hear again. George Burroughs, a former minister, had stood at the gallows and surprised everyone by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something believed to be impossible for a witch. Still, he was hanged. His voice, filled with grace, was silenced forever. Mary Easty, in her final letter, begged not for herself, but for mercy to be shown to others. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than one innocent person be condemned. Her voice, too, faded into the cold wind of Gallows Hill. The people of Salem could not undo the past. But they began, little by little, to listen again. To honor the names they had once cursed. To say, softly and solemnly, they were not witches. They were victims. Of fear. Of frenzy. Of faith twisted into judgment. And so, the whispers of accusation became whispers of apology. Let us listen for them now, not in fear, but in remembrance, for the lost voices still speak, in the hush of history. Among the chilling patterns of the Salem witch trials, one cruel truth stood out: those who confessed to witchcraft often lived, while those who claimed innocence, died. It was a strange and twisted reversal of justice. To admit to consorting with the devil, to say you had flown on broomsticks, signed his black book, or tormented your neighbors, these things, as shocking as they sounded, were seen not as death sentences, but as signs that you could be redeemed. Confession meant cooperation. And cooperation, they said, meant mercy. So many, faced with the noose, the stone, or the cold silence of a cell, whispered false confessions. Words they did not believe. Stories they were forced to invent. Details they gave only under pressure, fear, or unbearable despair. Deliverance Hobbs, a woman from Maine, confessed. Mary Warren, once one of the afflicted girls herself, later accused of witchcraft, confessed. Tituba, the enslaved woman at the heart of the First Accusations, confessed. And remained imprisoned for over a year, but was not executed. These women lived. But at a terrible cost. To confess was to lose your name. To lose your standing. To become both victim and accused. And worse, many who confessed were pressured to accuse others. The noose, in many cases, hung over more than just one neck. And so the confessions spread the fire further. Each new admission sparked a new arrest. A new suspicion. A new tragedy. Some confessed under torture. Others under the promise of release. Some after watching their friends hang. And yet, some, like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, refused to lie, even to save their lives. Their honor, their faith, their truth, would not be broken. John Proctor said before his death, "God forbid I take it from them who died on the gallows before me. I am no false man." He knew what silence would cost him. He chose it anyway. Years later, many of those who had falsely confessed tried to make peace. They wrote letters. Prayed for forgiveness. Some admitted their confessions were lies. That they had never seen spirits. Never flown. Never danced with the devil. Their voices were quieter now. Broken. Ashamed. But they, too, were victims. Not of magic. But of a world turned upside down, where truth was punished, and lies were rewarded. So let us sit in silence now, for the truth may save the soul, but in Salem, a lie could save the life. She was 12 years old when it began. And Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal of the afflicted girls, stood at the center of many accusations. With her wide eyes, trembling hands, and frightened voice, she cried out in court, claiming visions and spectral attacks. Dozens were condemned by her words. But years passed. And the fever broke. And grew quiet. The village moved on. Or tried to. But those who had survived the trials remembered her. And so did she. In 1706, 14 years after the hysteria, and Putnam Jr. did something no other accuser had done. She stood before her church, and apologized. Her voice was softer now. No longer a child's voice filled with dread and drama, but that of a woman, haunted, heavy with remorse. She said, "I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence. I was a chief instrument of accusing several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away. Though what was done by me ignorantly, yet it was a great transgression." She did not excuse herself. She did not pretend it hadn't happened. She owned it. Quietly. Tearfully. Many in the congregation wept. Others turned their faces away. Some had buried fathers. Mothers. Children. Some had lost everything. But Anne's confession was a turning point. A rare moment of truth, spoken not in fear, but in mourning. It did not undo the hangings. It did not return the dead. But it acknowledged the pain. The lies. The terrible cost of fear and faith twisted together. And lived the rest of her life quietly. Unmarried. In the same village. Surrounded by the shadows she helped to cast. She died at the age of 37. History remembers many names in the Salem Witch Trials. But hers, whispers differently. Not as a villain. Not as a hero. But as a reminder. That the line between victim and accuser is sometimes only as wide as a frightened breath. Let us pause now. And listen for the soft voice of repentance, drifting gently across time. Long after the executions ended, long after the jail doors opened, the wounds of Salem remained. Not the physical kind. But deeper ones. Spiritual wounds. Emotional scars. Invisible, but everywhere. The fields were quiet again. The churches filled once more. Children played cautiously in the lanes. But a kind of silence had taken hold, not the peaceful kind, but the haunted kind. One born of regret. Of things left unsaid. Those who had survived, carried guilt. Those who had lost, carried grief. And those who had spoken in accusation, often carried both. The gallows had been taken down. But in the minds of the people, they still stood. The image of a noose in the pale morning light. The way the ground had felt beneath their feet as they watched friends, neighbors, loved ones, die. Whispers passed through homes. Did you speak their name? Did you cry out in court? Did you believe it? Few answered out loud. The Proctor family struggled to restore their lands. The nurses could barely speak the name of Rebecca without weeping. The Corwins, the family of the sheriff who oversaw many arrests, carried a burden history would not forget. Some who had played roles in the trials simply left Salem. They vanished into the wilderness or other towns, never to speak of 1692 again. But silence did not equal peace. Churches began to split. The Puritan ideals, once iron-strong, began to weaken. Faith, which had fueled the trials, now seemed uncertain. How could a town that claimed to follow God have committed such darkness? Some turned away from religion altogether. Others clung tighter to it, desperate for comfort. And yet, the memory remained. In dreams. In sermons. In winter winds that passed by homes that had once belonged to the condemned. Gallows Hill remained untouched. For many years, it was left unnamed, a place too painful to speak of. Children were warned not to play there. Some believed the hill was cursed. Others simply avoided it out of reverence. What Salem needed was healing. But healing did not come quickly. No monument stood. No public confession by all who had played a role. Just time, and the slow, quiet work of remembrance. It would take generations before Salem dared to say the names again. To speak of justice, openly. To honor the lost, instead of hide the shame. But even then, in the hearts of many, the whispers never stopped. Let your breath be still now, for silence, though painful, sometimes says more than any words can. The law, once a hammer of judgment in Salem, began, ever so slowly, to soften. Years passed. People aged. Children who had watched their parents die at the gallows grew into adults, quiet, cautious, and forever marked by what they had witnessed. But the fight for justice, though slow and whispered, had begun. Families of the condemned started to petition the colonial government. They wanted more than apologies. They wanted names cleared. They wanted lands returned. They wanted history corrected. It was not easy. The court had spoken loudly in 1692, but now it was reluctant to speak again. To admit error. To reverse verdicts meant to admit that the system had failed. But those families, proctors, nurses, cories, did not give up. In 1711, nearly 20 years after the trials, the Massachusetts legislature finally passed a bill. It reversed the convictions of many who had been hanged. It offered financial compensation to their heirs. It was not perfect. Some names were left out. Some families received less than others. And the payments could never equal the weight of a lost life. Still, it was something. A few coins. A few pages of ink. A small crack of light in the long, dark hallway of Salem's past. For the families, it meant restoring honor. To be able to say, out loud, in church, in the town square. My mother was not a witch. My father was innocent. We were wronged. Over the next few decades, more names were added. More pardons issued. By the 20th century, yes, centuries later, historians and legislators worked to ensure that every last victim was officially cleared. It took until 2001, over 300 years after the trials, for the last 5 names to be formally exonerated by the state of Massachusetts. 300 years. That is how long it took to undo a moment of hysteria. The weight of the law, once crushing, was finally reversed. But the weight of memory remained. The names carved in history could now be honored. But the question lingered. How did a village lose its way so deeply? What happens when fear becomes law? And how many more must suffer before we remember, truly remember, the cost of forgetting reason? Breathe now, softly, as justice, though delayed, finally begins to whisper through the pages of time. Even after the final pardons. Even after the names were cleared and the laws rewritten. The spirits of Salem never truly left. Not the kind whispered of in courtrooms. Not the ones seen in night visions or spectral torment. But the real spirits, the memory of those who had lived, loved, and died, unjustly. Their presence lingers, not in fear, but in remembrance. Walk the old streets of Salem, and you can still feel them. The wooden boards of the meeting house, worn thin with age, echo with footsteps that are no longer there. The path to Gallows Hill, once unmarked and shrouded in silence, is now a place of reflection. A place where flowers are left, stones placed, names spoken aloud with reverence. Rebecca Nurse, hanged at 71 years old, is remembered at a quiet homestead where her spirit is said to still walk gently through the gardens. Giles Corey, pressed to death, is remembered in whispers among the graves. Some say his ghost appears before tragedy strikes. John Proctor, once slandered, is honored now as a voice of reason, his name spoken not with shame, but with sorrow and pride. And the town itself has become a monument. Salem, once a name that conjured fear, is now a place of pilgrimage. Of learning. Of stories. Visitors walk its cobbled streets not to hunt witches, but to understand how truth was lost, and how slowly it returned. Museums now tell the tales. Memorials stand quietly beneath trees and along stone walls. Each bears a name, a date, and a final breath remembered. It is not spectacle. It is not horror. It is history, whispered carefully into the ears of the present. For what happened in Salem was not simply about witches. It was about fear. About power. About the human need to understand the unknown, even at the cost of others. And that lesson, like the ghosts of Gallows Hill, walks with us still. In every courtroom. In every crowd driven by panic. In every time we choose silence over truth. So pause now. Let the air settle, and listen for the footsteps of memory, walking gently beside us, reminding us to never forget. By the time the 20th century arrived, the echoes of Salem had become more than history, they had become warnings, softly etched into the foundation of American identity. The Salem Witch Trials were no longer just a tale of a single village in 1692. They had become a symbol. A mirror held up to any society willing to listen to fear more than reason. To faith more than facts. To accusation more than understanding. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, the town of Salem erected a memorial, simple, solemn, and silent. A stone bench for each victim. Their names carved. Their final words remembered. Not loud. Not grand. But honest. The memorial stands not far from where the executions happened. It is shaded by trees, and surrounded by flowers. Visitors walk slowly, whispering the names, names once feared, now honored. Children sit beside the stones, asking questions their parents once weren't allowed to ask. Elderly descendants come to lay tokens of remembrance. Strangers light candles. The space is quiet. But not empty. It speaks, softly, to those who will listen. It says, "This is what happens when judgment replaces justice. This is what happens when we forget compassion. This is what happens, when we are silent in the face of madness." The lessons of Salem have echoed in other times. During the Red Scare, when neighbors turned on neighbors. During times of war, when suspicion overcame humanity. In classrooms, courtrooms, and conversations, whenever someone is punished for being different. History, they say, does not repeat. But it whispers. And Salem is a whisper we must never stop hearing. In modern Salem, the town has become a blend of remembrance and reflection. Shops with broomsticks and black hats line the streets, yes, but alongside museums, archives, and places of deep learning. There are voices that work tirelessly to separate truth from legend. To remind the world that the real tragedy was not magic. It was the fear of magic. And it was the loss of reason. The trials remind us that justice must be anchored in truth. That law must be tempered with mercy. And that the quietest voices, those of the accused, the lost, the forgotten, often carry the greatest truth. So let us pause here, before the stone, and hear the softest words speak the loudest truth: never again. Today, the streets of modern Salem feel far from the haunting stillness of 1692. Shops display crystals, books, candles, and symbols of witchcraft once feared, now embraced as a part of culture, curiosity, and personal belief. Tourists wander through cobbled lanes, visiting museums and reenactments. Costumed figures roam during October festivals. Laughter mingles with whispers. But beneath that surface, something deeper lingers. The real story of the Salem Witch Trials has not been lost, it has evolved. Historians, educators, and descendants work to ensure that the truth is not buried beneath commercial glitter. They walk the fine line between honoring memory and entertaining myth. And it is here, in the quiet corners, in the preserved documents, in the weathered gravestones, that the echoes still whisper. Modern Salem has become a paradox. A place of healing, and of haunting. Of learning, and of legend. Local teachers bring students to the memorial, to sit in silence and read aloud the names. Visitors from around the world come not to mock the past, but to understand it. To ask how fear once led to death. To see how quickly justice can be consumed by panic. Among the buildings, a few still stand from that time. The Witch House, once the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, now stands as a museum, its dark wooden beams watching over centuries. The Rebecca Nurse homestead remains preserved, a tribute to a woman whose quiet dignity outlived the frenzy that condemned her. And in Gallows Hill Park, the site of the executions once unmarked, now holds a memorial space. No longer feared. Now respected. Salem is not frozen in the past. It has become a living story, a constant reminder that truth must be defended, especially when fear rises. And even now, Salem serves as a voice against injustice. When other communities face false accusations, when hysteria takes root in headlines. When society punishes difference rather than embracing it. Salem rises from the pages of history to whisper. We have been here before. Let us not return. In this way, the spirits of 1692 are not ghosts. They are warnings. And they walk beside us still. So let us walk with them, not in fear, but in respect, and carry their story with care into every courtroom, every classroom, every quiet heart. As dusk falls over Salem, and the lanterns glow along its winding streets, a hush returns, soft as the sighing wind. It is in this hour, the names return. Not shouted. Not accused. But remembered, whispered in reverence. The 20 victims who died during the witch trials are more than just figures from a dark chapter. They are names spoken with care. They are stories left unfinished. They are echoes in the night air, asking not for pity, but for memory. Let us remember them, together. Bridget Bishop, the first to die, outspoken and misunderstood. Sarah Good, poor and defiant, who cursed the court with her last breath. Rebecca Nurse, beloved and innocent, who whispered her prayers even as the crowd condemned her. Elizabeth Howe, gentle and quiet, caught in suspicion. Susanna Martin, accused again and again, never broken. Sarah Wilds, whose past sins were used to paint her as evil. George Burroughs, a minister, who recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, yet was hanged. John Proctor, bold and rational, who begged for justice and died for it. Martha Carrier, who said her death would be the price of righteousness. George Jacobs Sr., betrayed by his own granddaughter's accusation. John Willard, once a constable, turned victim when he questioned the madness. Martha Corey, strong and faithful, who dared to doubt the trials. Mary Eastie, whose farewell letter still brings tears to readers centuries later. And Putiator, accused of unnatural strength, silenced by fear. Giles Corey, pressed beneath stones, refusing to speak, whispering only, "More weight." And the others who perished in prison. Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Lyndia Dustin, and Foster, and Mercy Good, Sarah's infant daughter, who died in chains before ever learning her name. Each of them left behind more than sorrow. They left behind a lesson. A voice. A story that must be retold, not in panic, but in peace. So now, as the wind brushes through the trees and the moonlight touches the stones, we sit in silence. And we listen. Not for ghosts, but for truth. And in this whispering hour, we say their names, not with fear, but with love. May they rest, finally, in peace, and may their voices never be forgotten. And so, we come to the final chapter. Not an ending, but a quiet resting place. For a story that must always be told softly. The Salem Witch Trials did not begin with fire or violence. They began with a whisper. A quiet accusation in the cold winter of 1692. A word, a glance, a shiver in the dark. And that whisper grew. Until it became a storm. But just as it began in silence, it ended in silence, too. The courtroom doors shut. The gallows stood empty. The voices once raised in fury fell to weeping. What remains today is not just a warning, but a way of seeing the world differently. To listen carefully before we judge. To ask questions before we act. To protect the vulnerable, even when the loudest voices say otherwise. Salem teaches us that truth can be buried by fear. That justice must be stronger than belief. That humanity must be greater than hysteria. And yet, beyond all the tragedy, there is something tender that lives on in this history. The courage of those who would not lie. The strength of families who fought to clear names. The stillness of the ones who stood in the shadow of the noose and held fast to their faith. They were not witches. They were not evil. They were people. And they deserved more. We remember them, not in frightful tales, but in reverence. When the wind rustles the leaves at Gallows Hill. When a candle flickers in a museum window. When a visitor places a flower beside a name etched in stone. They live again, quietly. And perhaps that's what history truly is. Not a shout. Not a battle. But a whisper carried forward. From ear to ear. From heart to heart. From past to present. So now. As the final page turns. Let the hush of this story settle into your breath. Let your eyes close gently. Let the voices grow soft. And listen. Listen to the whisper of history, reminding us always to stay kind, stay watchful, and never forget. Good night.